Ilhan loved the hijab. The fabric was beautiful. It was really some of the finest fabric I've ever seen. And I know fabric. Believe me, I know fabric. I've been in the real estate business for 50 years, and the drapes alone in my buildings? Tremendous. Just tremendous. It was a Thursday afternoon in February 2026, and the President of the United States was standing at the north end of the White House's East Room, addressing a joint press conference on border security and federal fraud enforcement. This was the kind of event where cameras outnumbered reporters 3-1, and every word was being clipped, captioned, recaptioned with different fonts, and uploaded to 6 different platforms before it even finished echoing off the marble and gilded walls. And it was then that he spotted the Congresswoman from Minnesota's 5th District, sitting in the 4th row with her arms crossed, wearing the composed, or slightly elevated expression of a woman who had decided that whatever was about to happen would be in her fundraising email by 9 o'clock tonight. Ilhan Omar was ready. She was always ready. She had been ready since the AI-packed tweets in February 2019, since the "some people did something" clip went viral in April 2019, since she married her campaign consultant in March 2020, and since Republicans removed her from the Foreign Affairs Committee in January 2023. And through all of it, the death threats, or the security details, the floor speeches, magazine covers, censure motions, and viral clips, she had refined her public face into something close to an art form. A weaponized serenity. Calm, precise, unhurried. It was the face of a woman who had survived a civil war in Somalia, 4 years in a Kenyan refugee camp, and 12 years in American politics, all of which, she had concluded, were roughly equivalent in difficulty, and who had arrived at the settled view that the best possible response to any attack was to look like it had not landed. She had her phone in her left hand, screen dark, ready. She had 3 staffers in the back row with their laptops open. She had a response prepared for approximately 17 different versions of what might happen next. She had 3 staffers positioned near the back wall with laptops, open browser tabs, and pre-drafted response tweets waiting in the composed window. She had, in other words, a system, a well-oiled, battle-tested system that had been in operation for 7 years, designed for turning attacks into ammunition. What Ilhan Omar had not modeled, what her communications team had not stress-tested, what her political instincts had not processed, and what her confidence had ultimately, fatally, dismissed. He was the difference between being attacked by Donald Trump on Truth Social and being attacked by Donald Trump in the East Room of the White House. On Truth Social, Omar had been operating in her natural environment. She had response time. She had staff. She had a counter-argument machine that had been running continuously since 2019, converting every Trump attack into a fundraising email. Every Republican criticism turned into a small dollar donation. At every moment of controversy became evidence for the story she was telling her supporters about herself. I am the woman they are afraid of. I am the voice they cannot silence. Send $25. It had worked. It had worked brilliantly. In fact, her fundraising numbers after the committee removal in 2023 had been the best of her career. Her national profile had grown every single time Trump typed her name. She had learned through experience that Trump's attention was not a threat, and it was a resource. But the East Room of the White House was not Truth Social. In the East Room, on a Thursday afternoon in February, with 40 reporters already leaning forward, a dozen cameras already locked on, and the entire apparatus of the American political media already calculating the angle, the framing, and the narrative. That machine was not in the room. That machine was in the district office in Minneapolis. All that was in the room was Omar and Trump, and the country watching in real time to find out what happened when the most relentless verbal combatant in American politics decided to stop performing and start prosecuting. "Congresswoman," Trump said, and something shifted in his voice. It wasn't the rally voice, not the grievance voice, not even the mock grievance voice he used when he wanted to make people laugh. It was something quieter, more deliberate. The voice of a man who had been doing this for a long time and who, on this particular Thursday afternoon, had decided to do something different. "I've been wanting to have a conversation with you, a real one, in person. Not through social media, not through your press office, not through the fundraising emails. And by the way, I've seen the fundraising emails, very well written. My name comes up a lot. You're welcome." Light laughter rippled through the room. The Republican members of the press corps shifted forward, and the Democrats were already reaching for their phones. "But I want to have a real conversation, because the people of Minnesota deserve one. You see, I've been reading, and I read a lot, a tremendous amount. People just don't realize how much I read about what's been happening in your state, in your district, and with your family's finances. And what I've been reading is, frankly, remarkable, and not in a good way, and I think it's time someone asked you about it directly, in a room, on camera, so the people of Minnesota, the people who sent you to Washington, who trusted you with their votes, who believed in your story, can finally hear the answers." He paused. The East Room fell silent, because right now, those answers were missing. To really understand what happened in the next 22 minutes, and to get why a joint White House press conference on border security suddenly became the most downloaded political clip of early 2026, racking up over 94 million views in 72 hours and taking over every show from Hannity to Morning Joe. You have to understand something about both of these people. It's something the breathless media coverage rarely bothered to explain, because explaining it requires context, and context requires time. And time was the one thing the modern political media machine had decided it just couldn't afford. The first thing you need to grasp is that Ilhan Omar, by any objective measure, is a genuinely remarkable person. She arrived in the United States back in 1995 as a 12-year-old refugee from Somalia, after surviving a civil war that killed members of her own family, spending 4 years in a Kenyan refugee camp, and watching her country completely fall apart in ways most Americans could never truly imagine. And from that starting point, she built a life that led to a college degree, a seat in the state legislature, and eventually a seat in the United States Congress, becoming one of the first 2 Muslim women ever elected in American history. That is a real story. It is, in the most literal and undeniable sense, an American story. And anyone who dismisses it completely is missing something vital about what this country is capable of. The second thing you have to understand, the piece that set the stage for what happened in the East Room that Thursday afternoon, is that Omar had been in Congress since January 2019. For 7 years. 7 years representing Minnesota's 5th congressional district, which covers all of Minneapolis and some of its closest suburbs. 7 years as one of the most prominent, celebrated, and nationally known members of Congress. 7 years of magazine covers, speaking fees, documentary films, and international panels. 7 years of fighting. 7 years of tweets, press releases, floor speeches, and viral moments. And at the end of those 7 years, Minnesota's 5th congressional district, the actual physical place with real people living in it, had, by almost every single metric, gotten worse. The poverty rate in the 5th district was among the highest of any congressional district in the entire Midwest. The black residents of Minneapolis, who were a large part of Omar's base, were about 4 times more likely to live in poverty than their white neighbors, not because of some recent event, but because of conditions that had only gotten worse during her time in office. In 2021, the year after she loudly backed the Defund the Police movement, the homicides in Minneapolis spiked to 97, tying the city's all-time record from 1995, the same year the city got its most brutal nickname, Murderapolis. Before that, in 2019, Minneapolis had actually been on a real downward trend for violent crime. That trend had reversed, and badly. The City Council voted in June of 2020 to dismantle the Minneapolis Police Department. Supporters called it a historic reckoning. And then, the murders spiked. The businesses that had somehow survived the summer protests started to close down. People who'd loved Minneapolis their whole lives started calculating commute times to the surrounding counties. Some of them left. The ones who stayed were the ones who had no other choice. And those who had no choice were, overwhelmingly, the very same people who had sent Ilhan Omar to Congress. And then, there was the fraud. $9 billion in government money, child nutrition funds, health care clinic money, to daycare subsidies, food program dollars, had simply vanished from the state of Minnesota in one of the largest fraud schemes in American history. More than 75 people were charged, many already convicted, and most of them were from the very Somali community that Omar represented. All while this fraud was unfolding, as federal investigators built their cases, as fake daycares cashed government checks for non-existent children, and phony food programs billed the state for meals never made. Ilhan Omar was on TV, on Twitter, and at global panels, branding the investigators as racists. That was the public record. It was like a ledger, just sitting on the table, waiting for someone to finally open it. "Come on up here," Trump said. And his tone had that uniquely warm quality of an invitation that was actually a dare. It was a tone his staff had heard countless times before, in rallies, boardrooms, courtrooms, and on debate stages. The kind of tone that signaled something was about to go down. And you could bet the cameras had better be rolling. "I want to have this conversation face to face, not from the 4th row. Right up here. Come to the microphone." Omar rose to her feet. She took her time, standing with the deliberate, unhurried calm of a woman who understood on a cellular level that in a room full of cameras, how you move is just as important as what you say when you finally arrive. So she straightened her jacket. She didn't even glance at her phone. She walked to the second microphone at the front of the room with the steady, measured stride of someone who'd been told she wouldn't survive in this business, yet had been doing just that for 12 years. And then she positioned herself just 3 feet from the President of the United States, looked him directly in the eye and said, "Mr. President, I appreciate the invitation, though I should note it's a bit easier to invite someone to a conversation when you're the one controlling the room, the microphone, and the cameras." A ripple of quiet laughter came from the back rows. The Democratic members of the press corps scribbled notes furiously. Trump smiled, not a full-throated laugh, but the kind of smirk that showed he felt the punch, knew exactly where it landed, and was already constructing his counterpunch with the calm efficiency of a man who'd been doing this for 50 years. "Well, I do control the room," he said. "That's a fair point. It is the White House, after all. I do live here. But the questions I'm about to ask you, those aren't my questions. They're not Republican questions. These are questions from Minneapolis. They're the questions that people in your own district have been asking quietly for a very long time. Yeah, and I figure today is as good a day as any to finally ask them out loud. So, let's begin." "Tim Mynett," Trump said. and the name hung in the air of the East Room, the way a name does when everyone in the room already knows it and was just waiting to see who would be the first to say it. Your husband. Great guy, political consultant, smart, hardworking, very, very good at his job. But just how good? Apparently, $3 million good. Nearly $3 million, apparently, are from your own campaign account. Money that your donors, the small-dollar donors, the folks who sent in $20, $40, $100 because they believed in you and your message, gave to your campaign. You collected that money to fight for the working people of Minnesota, and instead, you sent it to your husband. Omar's voice was steady, clearly practiced. It was a voice that years of being the most attacked member of Congress had sharpened into something near a precision instrument. Mr. President, all payments made to consultants were fully disclosed to the Federal Election Commission and were found to be completely within legal guidelines. That arrangement was terminated after the 2020 election. Everything was transparent and entirely above board. Disclosed. Great, Trump replied, with the cheerful, patient energy of a man who had been waiting for that exact answer. I love disclosure. I'm a big believer in disclosure. But you see, and here's the thing about disclosure. Just because you disclose something that's technically legal doesn't automatically make it right. It just means you announced what you were doing while you were doing it. And what you were doing was writing checks from your supporters' money directly into your husband's bank account, which, and I want to be charitable here, I really do, is a very strange thing for a congresswoman who talks non-stop about corruption and accountability to be doing. It's a strange look for a woman who built her career calling out powerful people for enriching themselves at the expense of ordinary folks, don't you think? He didn't wait for her to answer. But let's just say it was all fine and dandy. Let's say that $3 million was squeaky clean, totally proper, no problem at all. Let's talk about what happened next, because this is where it gets even more interesting. Your husband, after that campaign relationship ended, after he stopped billing your campaign for his consulting work, went on to start a wine company, EST Crew LLC, a winery based out in California. Very sophisticated, very entrepreneurial of him. He paused for just a beat. The entire room had gone dead silent. Now, Ilhan, you're a Muslim woman, a devout Muslim woman. You've made your faith a core part of your public identity, and I respect that, I really do. Religious expression is a very important thing. But in the faith of Islam, and the production and sale of alcohol is strictly forbidden. It is considered haram. And yet, your husband owns a winery. He produces wine. He sells that wine. He profits from the sale of that wine. And through all of this, you have remained completely silent. Not a single word. Not one explanation. Because an explanation would force you to choose between your public faith and your family's income. And that's a choice you've apparently decided you won't make in public. Omar took a sharp, controlled breath, like a woman holding something back. My husband's business is completely separate from my work as a public servant. My faith is a personal matter, and I won't let this podium be used to attack the sincerity of anyone's religious beliefs. No one questioned your beliefs, Trump said, cutting her off with the clean, unhurried precision of a tennis pro hitting a perfect, point-ending shot. I just described them. I described your beliefs, as you've stated them publicly, and your husband's business, as it's been publicly documented. They just seem to contradict each other. That isn't my opinion. That's just an observation. The contradiction itself is what's doing the work. I'm just the one reading it out loud. He then turned to his index card. The same index card that, after 7 years of political battles, had become as famous as any prop in American politics. Now, let's talk about the money, the part that's much harder to explain. In 2023, your husband's company, a venture capital firm called Rose Lake Capital, was worth somewhere between $1 and $1,000. That is what you reported on your own financial disclosure. From $1 to $1,000. Not much at all. Maybe it was a struggling startup, just a dream. And then, just 1 year later, in 2024, that same company was suddenly worth $30 million. Not 30,000, not 300,000, 30 million in a single year. From less than $1,000 to 30 million. He looked right at her. I'm a businessman, Congresswoman. I've been a businessman my entire adult life. I've looked at a lot of financial statements. I've evaluated a lot of deals. And I'm telling you, as someone who knows what $30 million looks like, see that the kind of growth it takes to get there in 1 year for a company worth basically nothing just 12 months before, that doesn't happen from selling wine. It doesn't happen from venture capital returns in a normal market. That kind of growth happens when someone with a lot of resources funnels them into a company very, very quickly. And the same question the House Oversight Committee has been asking, the same one federal investigators have been asking, and the one the people of Minnesota deserve an answer to, is simply, who? Who put $30 million into your husband's company during the exact year that 75 people from your community were convicted of stealing $9 billion from the state? Sanad. The room fell so quiet, you could actually hear the hum of the cameras. We don't know the answer, Trump continued. Your husband completely missed the Oversight Committee's deadline to produce those records. He just missed it. Your office called the investigation let me find the exact quote, I want to be precise here, a political stunt. Those were your words, a political stunt. $30 million appearing in a single year. Federal investigators circling, travel records being requested to the United Arab Emirates, Somalia, and Kenya. And you have the nerve to call the investigation a stunt. Omar leaned forward, right into her microphone. And now, something was in her voice that hadn't been there before. It wasn't exactly anger, but that compressed, heated energy that sits just underneath it. The voice of someone whose personal story was being challenged in a way she couldn't just brush off with a fundraising email. Mr. President, the House Oversight Committee is led by partisan Republicans who've made it a priority to target me since the day I was elected. There is absolutely no evidence connecting me or my husband to any of the fraud in Minnesota. None. Zero. The Ethics Committee got the referral and has produced zero findings because there are no findings to produce. And for you to stand up here and imply otherwise, with no evidence, no charges, it's nothing but innuendo. I'm not implying a thing, Trump said. I'm reading the financial disclosure forms you filed, the forms you are legally required to file, the very forms that show your household went from a negative net worth in 2019. You yourself reported a negative net worth. You said it yourself. You had student loans and no assets, and then suddenly you're worth between $6 and $30 million by the end of 2024. Those are your numbers. I didn't make them up. You're the one who filed them. He then turned to the whole room. Now, maybe there's a perfectly clean explanation for all this. Maybe your husband really is a brilliant venture capitalist who built a $30 million portfolio in 12 months, all through sheer skill. Maybe the investors are all legit, the records are all clean, and maybe the travel to 3 countries directly connected to a $9 billion fraud investigation is a complete coincidence. Maybe. I'd love to know. So would the Oversight Committee. So would the federal investigators. And so would the people of Minneapolis, who are just waiting for their congresswoman to simply say, "Here are the records. Here's where the money came from. Here's why my family went from being broke to worth $30 million, all while $9 billion was being stolen from your kids' school lunches." He paused. The silence hung heavy, making everyone uncomfortable. "We're still waiting," he said. But here's what I really want to talk about," Trump stated, his voice shifting for the third time in their conversation, moving from a prosecutorial tone to something softer, yet somehow more cutting. "Because the money side is one thing, and the Ethics Committee will make its decisions, and federal investigators will follow the evidence wherever it leads. That's their job. My job, right now, in this room, is to ask you about your job." He glanced down at the index card in his hand. "So you've served as the Congresswoman for Minnesota's 5th District since January of 2019. That's 7 years. 7 years in Congress. And over those 7 years, you've appeared on television approximately 10,000 times. You've conducted hundreds of interviews. You've spoken at conferences in Geneva. You've addressed the United Nations. You've even graced the cover of Time magazine. You've been the focus of a documentary film that played at the Tribeca Film Festival. You've even been in a Maroon 5 music video, which, honestly, I might be the most impressive item on that list. And I actually like Maroon 5. A few chuckles broke the tension. The tightness in the room eased just a bit, like a pressure valve letting off some steam before being sealed shut once more. During those same 7 years, right there in your district in Minneapolis, the actual city where real people live, the very people who elected you, these things happened. The poverty rate remained stubbornly high, among the highest in the Midwest. See, with black residents roughly 4 times more likely to live in poverty than their white neighbors. Homicides in 2021 reached 97, matching the city's all-time record, a record set back in 1995, a year they literally called Murderous Minneapolis. And that surge in homicides occurred directly following your movement. And I want to make this very clear. I'm calling it your movement because you were its most prominent national voice, pushing the Minneapolis City Council to defund the police. Omar's expression remained unchanged. Yet, something had shifted beneath the surface. It wasn't exactly visible, but it was perceptible, much like sensing a change in the weather before the first raindrop falls. "And here's the crucial point about the police," Trump continued. "When you advocated to defund the police, when you and your colleagues appeared on television declaring, 'Don't defund the police and abolish ICE and all the rest,' you weren't engaging in some abstract ideological debate. You were doing it in a tangible city, with actual streets, and real people living on those streets. And those people, the ones who couldn't afford to leave Minneapolis when crime worsened, the ones who didn't own a second home in the suburbs, the ones working 2 jobs and sending their kids to schools in neighborhoods where crime was rampant, those people paid the price, but not you. You have a security detail protecting you. You've been under federal law enforcement protection since at least 2019. The residents of Minneapolis's most vulnerable neighborhoods did not have a security detail. They had only what the depleted, defunded, demoralized police force, a force your movement helped create, was capable of providing, which simply wasn't enough. "Not nearly enough," Omar interjected, her voice still controlled, but the effort was now palpable. You could hear the strain in her words. "Mr. President, The movement for police accountability that arose in 2020 was a direct response to the murder of George Floyd, who was killed right in my district by a police officer, and with the entire city watching. I will never apologize for standing in solidarity with the families who demanded accountability for that heinous killing. And to conflate the demand for accountability with rising crime rates is a deliberate misrepresentation of the truth of what actually happened. Root. George Floyd, Trump said, and his voice transformed, suddenly and completely different now. Gone was the prosecuting tone, the hint of sarcasm. Instead, it was something far simpler, and the flat, plain tone of a man stating a fact he genuinely wished wasn't true. That was a tragedy. It was wrong. I said it was wrong. I said it at the time it happened. And the officer responsible was convicted and sent to prison. That, right there, is the system functioning. That is accountability. He looked directly at her. But here's the actual reality. There were 47 other homicide victims in Minneapolis in 2019, before George Floyd, before the protests. He and every single one of those additional 50 victims had a name. They had a family. So they had people who loved them and who are still grieving them today. And I genuinely want to ask you, because I don't think anyone has directly asked you on camera and held the microphone until you gave an answer, how many of those 50 people knew your name? How many of them followed you on Twitter? How many of them were alive long enough to donate $25 to your next campaign? Silence filled the room, and it was that particular silence that fills a room after a question has been asked that has no good answer, and everyone knows it, especially the person who needs to answer it. The people of Minneapolis don't need a symbol. Trump said they need a congresswoman. They need someone who comes home, who knocks on doors, who sits with families, and who asks the hard questions. Why the fraud happened, why the money is missing, why the safety nets were exploited, and why $9 billion meant for children ended up in someone else's pocket. They need someone who says, "This happened in my district, on my watch, and I am going to do something about it." Not someone who goes on television to call the investigators racist. They need something real. Omar had been taking the punches the way she always took them, absorbing them, calculating, and waiting for an opening. She had been in tougher rooms than this. She had stood on the floor of the House of Representatives and read names into the record while her colleagues walked out. She had received death threats that forced her to change her route home from the Capitol. She had been called things in floor speeches that she would never repeat in front of her children. She had been through things that would have ended most careers. Yet, she was still here. And to her, the fact that she was still here was the most important political fact about herself. She now leaned forward into the microphone with the composed, deliberate force of a woman who had decided that the time for absorbing blows was over. I want to respond to several things that have just been said, because the people watching deserve the truth, not a performance. She looked directly at Trump, not at the cameras, but at him. My district is the 5th Congressional District of Minnesota. It is one of the most diverse districts in the United States of America. It is home to immigrants from Somalia and Ethiopia, from Vietnam and Mexico, and from every corner of the world. It is home to people who came here with nothing and built something. It is home to people who look like me, who have never in the history of this country had someone in Congress who looked like them, or knew what their lives were like, or was willing to fight for their interests against a system that has spent generations treating them as invisible. You mentioned the poverty rate. The poverty rate in my district is high because systematic disinvestment in communities of color has created structural inequalities that predate my election by decades. I did not create those inequalities. What I have done in my 7 years in Congress is fight to address them against a Republican majority that has cut housing funds, cut healthcare funds, cut education funds, and cut every program that might have made a difference, all while protecting tax cuts for the billionaires in this room. Her voice was gaining something, not height exactly, but density. The practiced calm was becoming something realer. You mentioned the fraud in Minnesota. The fraud in Minnesota is real and it is serious, and the people who committed it deserve to be prosecuted. Every single one of them. I have said that publicly, repeatedly. What I have also said is that using a fraud investigation as an excuse to terrorize an entire community, to send federal agents into a neighborhood in numbers that exceed the local police force, to threaten deportation of people who have been Americans for decades, to cut child nutrition programs because some people running them were lying, is not justice. It is collective punishment. And as someone who has studied history, the collective punishment of an entire ethnic community for the crimes of individuals is something I recognize. She paused for a beat and then delivered the line her team had prepared for this moment. The line she had rehearsed on the car ride from Capitol Hill. The line designed to be the clip. The line that was going to be in every Democratic fundraising email for the next 3 months. You have made a political career out of fear. Fear of immigrants, fear of Muslims, and fear of women who refuse to be quiet. And every time you stand at a podium and point at someone who looks like me and ask, where did the money come from? You are not conducting oversight. You are doing what you have always done. You are telling a certain kind of American that people who look like me do not belong here. And after everything I have survived, the camp, the Civil War, the threats, all of it, I have to tell you, with all due respect, that is not going to work. The room held its breath. Even the cameras seemed to slow down. Trump let the breath hang in the air. The pause was clearly calculated, and everyone in the room knew it was, but it still worked because it conveyed, I heard you. I'm not afraid of what you just said. And I have a response. That was very well said, Trump finally remarked, his voice quiet, almost conversational. Very well written, I should say, because that was undeniably a speech. It was a prepared speech, and it managed to hit all the right notes. The divisions, the echoes of civil war, the Islamophobia, the underlying fear, it was all there. It was very effective. Your team is exceptionally good. I'd honestly give that speech an A-. He then looked directly at her. But here's what your speech didn't actually do. It didn't answer the question about the $30 million. The speech didn't explain why the Oversight Committee still hasn't received those records. It didn't tell the parents in North Minneapolis why the daycares their children were enrolled in turned out to be fake. And it certainly didn't tell the grandmother, whose food assistance was siphoned off by fraudulent invoices, why you spent more time on panels about Palestine than asking questions about where the money in your own district was going. You said the fraudsters deserve to be prosecuted. Fine. Agreed. Good. But what you didn't say, what you've never said, is, I'm sorry this happened in my district. I didn't see it coming. I didn't ask enough questions. And I will do everything in my power to ensure it never happens again. Instead, you claim the investigators were the problem. You called this collective punishment. You brought up Islamophobia. He slowly shook his head, not with his usual theatrical gesture, but with something closer to genuine weariness. Congresswoman, when $9 billion vanishes from children's lunch programs in your district, the first question isn't, Are the investigators racist? The first question is, where did that money go? Who took it? And what exactly was I doing while it was being taken? Omar's voice cut in sharply as she replied, I introduced legislation in 2022 to strengthen oversight mechanisms for child nutrition programs. What happened to that legislation? It didn't advance because Republicans, your party, controlled the House in 2021 and 2022. Democrats had the majority. So, what happened to the legislation when Democrats controlled the House? There was a pause then, a real one, not a dramatic committee scheduling kind of pause. Omar eventually said there were competing priorities. Competing priorities, Trump repeated, not mockingly, simply stating the words, letting them hang in the room at their actual weight. $9 billion being stolen from children. Competing priorities. I want to say one more thing, Trump stated. His voice had dropped even further, a quieter now, yet somehow, because of that, it felt louder, the way quiet things often are, because they demand the room leans in to listen. In March 2019, 7 years ago, you gave a speech to the Council on American Islamic Relations in California, and in that speech, you chose to describe the September 11th attacks. You described the day when 3,000 Americans were killed, the single worst terrorist attack in the history of this country, the attack that killed firefighters, our office workers, janitors, stockbrokers, and people from 190 countries who just happened to be in Lower Manhattan that morning. You described that attack as some people did something. The East Room became absolutely still. Some people did something, Trump repeated. He said it flatly, without inflection, without contempt, no hint of comedy. Just those words, hanging in the quiet air of the room. Some people did something. Now, I've heard every possible explanation for that phrase. I've been told it was taken out of context. I've been told she was discussing civil liberties, not about the attack itself. I've been told that the clip was edited. And maybe all of that is true. But here's what I personally know. A man named Nicholas Harris Jr. from New Jersey lost his mother in the World Trade Center that day. His mother's name was Frances. She worked for a financial firm, way up on the 88th floor of the South Tower. And on the 18th anniversary of that attack, Nicholas Harris Jr. stood at Ground Zero in New York City, right at the ceremony where they read the names of the lost. And he wore a shirt with those very words, "Some people did something," printed on it. Then he looked straight into the camera and said, "Today I am here to respond to you exactly who did what to whom." He looked at Omar, that man, that son, grieving his mother, and standing at the very place she died. He heard how you described the worst day of his entire life. He heard the words you chose, and he went to Ground Zero, wearing those words on his shirt so that you and everyone else would have to see them. Because as the son of someone killed that day, he felt some people did something, simply didn't do justice to what his mother went through. What 3,000 people experienced, what their families are still experiencing. A moment of silence followed. I'm not saying you hate America. I'm not saying you're not American. I'm saying that words truly matter. What I'm saying is, when you're a member of the United States Congress describing the attack that killed 3,000 Americans, you owe it to those 3,000 people and their families to find words that are adequate for what happened. And some people did something is not adequate. It has never been adequate. And the fact that you have never, not once in 7 years, In 10,000 interviews and floor speeches and magazine covers, found different words for that moment is something the people of Minnesota's 5th District have a right to think about. Omar was very still. "You said I make my career on fear," Trump continued. Maybe some of my supporters are motivated by fear. That's worth examining. But what about your career? What are the emotions that your career runs on? Because from where I'm standing, your career runs on grievance. On the idea that America is a place that has done terrible things to people who look like you, and that your job is to fight back against it forever, regardless of what is actually happening in the city and the district you were sent to serve. That's a powerful story. It resonates. It raises money. It fills arenas. I know I have a story like that too. But stories eventually have to connect to something real. They have to connect to the streets, to the schools, and to the places where real people live. And when the story disconnects from the streets, when the Congresswoman is on television talking about Gaza while fake daycares are stealing from her constituents, when the Congresswoman is at the Tribeca Film Festival while $9 billion is disappearing from Minnesota, that is when the story stops being advocacy and becomes something else. He stepped back from the lectern slightly, not retreating, but repositioning, what the way a speaker does when they want the next thing they say to land in a different register. "I came to this country," he said, quietly enough that the room had to lean in. "Actually, my family came to this country. My mother came from Scotland. My grandfather came from Germany. They came with nothing. They came to a country that was not always kind to immigrants, and they built something. And I have spent my life building things, buildings, companies, a presidency. And I know what building looks like. Building looks like results. Building looks like something you can point to and say, I made that. That exists because of what I did." He looked at Omar directly. "What did you build, Congresswoman? Not for your career, not for your brand, not for the international panels and the documentary film and the 47 co-sponsored bills that never passed. For Minneapolis, for the people of the 5th District, for the grandmother in North Minneapolis whose grocery money was being stolen, for the kid in South Minneapolis whose school was underfunded, for the family who had a small business and watched it close while the city became, for 2 years, a place where nobody wanted to be. What did you build?" The silence lasted longer than any silence had a right to last in a room that contained 40 reporters. Omar spoke. "I represent more than 400,000 people in the 5th Congressional District. See, and I will put my record of advocacy for those people against any politician in this country." "Advocacy," Trump said. "Advocacy. 7 years of advocacy for 400,000 people in one of the poorest districts in the Midwest, and the poverty rate is the same. The crime went up and then came partway back down. $9 billion was stolen from children. And when the investigators came, when the federal government finally came to find out where the money went, you called it Islamophobia." He turned to the room, not performing now. The performance had ended 5 minutes ago, somewhere around the moment he mentioned Francis Haros by name. What was happening now was something quieter, and because of that, more damaging. Here is what I know about public service. The people of Minneapolis's 5th Congressional District deserve a representative who wakes up every morning thinking about them. Not about Gaza, not about the Tribeca Film Festival, not about the next fundraising email. About them. About the woman who is working 2 jobs and still can't afford rent. About the family whose kid fell behind in school. About the business owner who closed their doors. About the people who are gone now, who left Minneapolis, who gave up on it, who moved to Wisconsin or Iowa or anywhere that felt safer, because the city they grew up in stopped feeling like theirs. He stopped. And then he said the thing that would run in every clip. Oh, that would anchor every news segment. That would be the sentence people quoted to each other for weeks. The story of Ilhan Omar coming to this country from a refugee camp and becoming a member of Congress is genuinely remarkable. I mean that. And I think somewhere inside that story, there was a version of this that could have been extraordinary. A woman who understood hardship at a level most Americans never will. Using that understanding to rebuild the city she represented, fighting for every single person with the fierce determination of someone who truly knows what it's like to have nothing. Now, that version of the story would have been something incredible. He just looked at her. I don't know what happened to it. Just 14 minutes later, Omar's post went live. It read, "Trump just spent an hour in the East Room attacking a refugee woman who built her American dream from a tent in Kenya. Same playbook, same fear, same hatred. It's not going to work. And donate if you're with us. Link in bio." The post exploded, getting 7 million impressions in just 2 hours. Within 72 hours, the video clip of their full exchange racked up 94 million views across all platforms, making it the most watched political showdown of early 2026, even bigger than the NGA's clash with Nuome 4 months prior. As you'd expect, the reactions split right down the usual fault lines of American politics. The liberal media praised Omar for her composure, especially for that moment when she declared, "That is not going to work." MSNBC played that clip on a constant loop. Her Act Blue page brought in $4 million in just 48 hours. Progressive Twitter called it a clear win for her, a total self-own for Trump, and proof of everything they believed about him and his impact on the country. Meanwhile, conservative media hammered on the $30 million. They talked about the fraudsters. They brought up the defunding movement, and the 97 murders, and the failed oversight legislation. They replayed the Francis Harrow clip from Ground Zero, with the sun on his shirt and those words printed across his chest. In fact, Fox News played that clip 17 times before 11 a.m. But there was another group of people watching, the ones who weren't already decided, the persuadable, the uncertain, those who had once supported Omar but were now starting to have questions, and even those who'd always disliked Trump but had also seen how Minneapolis had changed over the last 7 years. These people noticed something that the partisan coverage was completely missing. It was something you couldn't argue about on social media, or spin with a communications team, or turn into a fundraising opportunity. Omar never actually answered the question about the $30 million, and she had just called it a political stunt. Omar didn't explain how her household went from a negative net worth to somewhere between $6 and $30 million in only 6 years. Instead, she labeled that observation a disinformation campaign. Omar also hadn't addressed what her 7 years in office had actually produced for the real people in the district she represented. She had talked about advocacy, and when Trump asked her directly, on camera in the White House, on what she had built, her answer was that she had engaged in advocacy for 400,000 people, and that her record could stand against any politicians. Advocacy, 400,000 people, and 47 co-sponsored bills that never passed. Speaking off the record to Politico, a Democratic strategist delivered a line so good the reporter just had to publish it. They said, "The problem isn't that he attacked her on her identity. She's better at that fight than anyone in the country. And the problem is that when he asked what she'd actually done for Minneapolis, she had to talk about advocacy." And the people of Minneapolis know exactly what advocacy means. It means nothing changed. But there was another layer of damage, one that took a bit longer to become clear. For the past 3 years, Omar's entire political identity was built on one simple, electrifying idea. I am the woman they are afraid of. Every attack from Trump, every censure motion, every committee removal, every single controversy, she had turned all of it into proof of that idea, and it had been working. Her fundraising was incredible. Her national profile was huge. By any standard of political celebrity, she was one of the most famous members of Congress in the entire country. But that exchange in the East Room brought up a new question that her central idea couldn't answer. Afraid of what, exactly? Were they afraid of the fraud investigation that she was dismissing as a stunt? And were they afraid of the records her husband still hadn't produced? Were they afraid of the questions about the $30 million that appeared in a single year? The whole "they are afraid of me" story needed an underlying strength, something that could actually hold up under scrutiny. It needed a record that, when you looked at it, justified that fear. And the examination that took place in the East Room wasn't about her identity, her origins, or her faith. It was an examination of the ledger. And that ledger didn't match what the brand had promised. A week after the East Room exchange, the House Oversight Committee once again extended the deadline for Tim Minett's business records. Federal investigators kept on working. The $30 million remained unexplained. Its source was still undisclosed, and its connection to the Minnesota fraud was neither confirmed nor ruled out. And back in the 5th Congressional District of Minnesota, in the neighborhoods, mosques, community centers, schools, and apartment buildings, the people who had once so passionately believed in Ilhan Omar's story were just living their daily lives. Fraud had taken place, the police had been defunded, the daycares were a sham, the money had disappeared, the poverty rate hadn't budged, murders had spiked before dipping slightly. Businesses had closed down, and those who could afford to leave had left. This wasn't true because Donald Trump said it was. It was true because the records said so. And the records told the story. Unlike the fundraising emails, the viral clips, the magazine covers, the documentary, and the 47 bills that never got a vote, the records didn't need a communications team to exist. They only needed someone to read them. The thing about a record is, it doesn't care about your story. It doesn't care how you got here, how hard your journey was, or how many people tried to stop you. A record is simply what happened. It is the sum of all decisions made, our priorities chosen, fights picked, and fights avoided. It's visible to anyone who bothers to look. It cannot be explained away with a speech, no matter how well written it is. It cannot be wished away by a viral post, no matter how much money it raises. In 2028 or 2030, or whenever Ilhan Omar gets on a stage in front of the wider American electorate and asks for something more than she's already been given, someone will ask her about Minneapolis, about the fraud, about the $30 million, about the 97 murders and the defunded police department, and the 47 bills that never passed. Someone will ask her what she built, and the answer won't be in a fundraising email. It will be in the records, in the numbers, in the city, in the district, in the people who are still there, and in the people who left. Not because Donald Trump put those questions on the table, but because Minneapolis did.